avoid is turning back or being tempted to turn back on our faith when things are not going well. Then the last pitfall that I want us to avoid, we'll see in the patriarchs, then we'll apply here at the end, is, if I can put it this way, ignoring the journey or wishing it away or simply enduring the journey because we're so focused on the destination. And here's what I mean by that. Sometimes I think it's tempting, again, on a road trip to get so fixed on getting there that we sort of miss everything and we just all plug into screens or whatever it is that you do in your car just to endure and to get there. And again, I think sometimes we miss those conversations in the car. We miss some of those times of bonding, or we miss the significance of the journey itself. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, this is infiltrated, I think, some of our Christian theology when we start talking about being strangers and pilgrims, that all of a sudden it starts to turn into this earthly life really doesn't matter at all because heaven's all that matters. Now, usually nobody says it that explicitly, but again, we want to avoid that as well. Because we are strangers, because we're pilgrims and sojourning, yes, our eyes are on heaven, but what we do in this life, what we do in this world matters a lot. The journey matters. The destination matters, but the journey matters too. God has a purpose in the journey He's got you on. So as we think about ourselves, as we think about our journey of faith, we want to avoid those things, and those are things that I think tempted the patriarchs, and we want to avoid as well. So, as I said before, the concept of a journey or sojourning, it's a common one in the Bible, and we see this in the lives of the patriarchs. We've already talked about Abraham here a couple of weeks ago here at Anchor Church. Abraham, of course, was called by God to go out from Ur, from the city he lived in called Ur, to go out from Ur to a land he didn't know, and God said, just start walking and I'll tell you when you get there. So Abraham, by faith, is going to do that. But then, as we're going to look at today, we've got Isaac, we've got Jacob, these other patriarchs that are called by God to literally wander, to literally go on a journey of faith as they're going about trying to find the land that God promised to Abraham in Genesis 12. And along with that, they're trying to see those other parts of the promise fulfilled. Right, that God told Abraham, you're going to have descendants like the sands of the sea, and you're going to bless everybody on earth, and I'm going to give you this land and all of that. We've got these people in the Old Testament literally doing that. Again, we'll see that today in Hebrews 11. But it's interesting, different authors in the New Testament pick up on this theme as well. That again, even though you and I today are not literally wandering around looking for a piece of dirt in the Middle East, the authors of the New Testament say, okay, through Christ, we are now part of a kingdom, not necessarily a physical piece of dirt, but we're part of a kingdom now. And as part of that kingdom, Paul says, for instance, to the Philippians, you're citizens of heaven. You're on earth right now, but you're actually citizens of heaven. Peter picks up on this. Peter says, you should live a holy life in 1 Peter chapter 1. He says, you should live a holy life, understanding that you are strangers and pilgrims on earth. So again, the authors of the New Testament pick up on this, and they challenge us to see ourselves as being on a journey of faith. Whether it's good and we have to avoid distraction, whether it's bad and we have to avoid that temptation to turn back, or whether we're just tempted to wish away the journey, we're on a journey of faith with God. And I think we're going to see this again in Hebrews chapter 11. So here's my theme for today, my big idea for today, and then we'll jump into Hebrews chapter 11 for a few minutes. So theme, or the big idea today that I think we'll see in the lives of the patriarchs and hopefully in our lives as well, is that successful pilgrims must have faith in the promises of God. Successful pilgrims must have faith in the promises of God. Now, when I use the word pilgrims, I think that possibly confused my kids a little bit because, of course, they're thinking, pilgrims and Thanksgiving. And, of course, when I'm saying pilgrims here, I'm talking about a sojourner, somebody that's on a journey. And what we're going to see for the patriarchs and for us as well is that to do that journey well, to make it, whereas the author of Hebrews says to enter the rest, to get there, to make it, to get across the finish line, we've got to have faith in the promises of God. And faith really is implicit in any journey you take. Now, I realize you may be thinking, I don't have to have faith in directions. I have my iPhone. Well, okay, you still have faith in the iPhone to find, the address that you're going to, but any journey requires some faith. Faith that the destination's there. Faith that the destination's going to be good. Faith that the people that told me about this place I should go with my kids, faith that they're really telling me the truth. So any journey necessitates faith, but specifically our journey of faith with God, our journey with God requires faith. In fact, at the end of Hebrews chapter 10, we have a phrase that's repeated throughout the New Testament. End of Hebrews chapter 10, we're told that the righteous shall live by faith. That's the way we live. That's the way we walk, and that's what we're going to see here. So as I thought about this, successful pilgrims must have faith in the promises of God. One of the reasons I picked the word pilgrim is I thought about the book Pilgrim's Progress. I want to ask you to raise your hand if you've read that. If you haven't read it, that should go on your summer reading list. I know that just sounded like a teacher right then, but forgive me, okay? That should go on your summer reading list. It used to be you could get this for free, online, a lot of e-readers and stuff. That's one of the freebie books, you can download. And you should read it, and if the old English scares you off, get the kids' illustrated edition. That's better than nothing, okay? But part of the reason I picked this is Pilgrim's Progress is a story written by a guy named John Bunyan, and it's an allegorical story of a person named Christian, obviously representing you and I, that goes on this pilgrimage, and he goes from the city of destruction, where he starts, and he's trying to get to the celestial city at the end. And I won't spoil it for you, but it has a happy ending, okay? So you should read it, okay? Here's the point, though, as I was thinking about that, I thought about Pilgrim's Progress, I went back and brushed up on it, and that's part of the reason I chose the word pilgrim. I don't know, I just like the book and like the story. There's one quote from Pilgrim's Progress that I like that I want to read, okay? In Pilgrim's Progress, Pilgrim, or Christian, I should say, the pilgrim named Christian, he's going to meet a guy named Evangelist. An evangelist in Pilgrim's Progress is like some of the evangelists I grew up hearing. And what I mean by that is not a slam, but this is like the quote-unquote hellfire brimstone kind of evangelist. In Pilgrim's Progress, he actually has this burning mountain behind him, which would be a really dramatic backdrop, right, for preaching if I had, a volcano behind me. Anyway, so evangelist is going to meet Pilgrim, and he's going to tell him the way to get to the celestial city, but he's going to tell him something that he is going to need. He's going to tell Pilgrim, or Christian who's the pilgrim, that he is going to need faith to make it there. So this is the words of the character called Evangelist, and he's talking to Christian, and he's encouraging him to make this journey. Evangelist says, "Let the kingdom be always before you." Now, at this moment in time in the book, we've left the city of destruction, but the celestial city is very far away, okay? So Evangelist is calling Christian here to have faith, and faith in that kingdom. Let that always be in front of you. Let that always be on your mind. Then Evangelist tells Christian, believe with certainty and consistency the things that are yet unseen. That sound like Hebrews 11, 1, 2, 3 a little bit? Right, believe, have faith in the things that are unseen. Let nothing that is on this side of eternal life get inside you. Above all, take care of your own hearts and resist the desires that tempt you, for your hearts are deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Set your face like a flint, for you have all the power of heaven and earth on your side. So when John Bunyan, the guy that wrote this, when he wrote that, I think he got the right idea. That for his character to make this journey, to make this pilgrimage, faith had to be there. And again, I think that's what we're going to see here in Hebrews chapter 11. So again, our theme for today, successful pilgrims must have faith in the promises of God. And I want to jump in to the book of Hebrews now, and I think it'll be up on your screens for you. Alluded to this earlier, but of course the original audience of Hebrews, those people, they're going through a really, really tough time. And again, if you were to go read the end of chapter 10, which I'm not going to take time to do today, which of course rolls right into 11, the author of Hebrews is reminding the people some of the stuff that they've been through. And again, it's getting tough. It's getting tough for Christians when this book is being written. And of course, today, we're blessed in this country to not face a lot of that persecution, but I'm sure our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world would resonate probably much more with this passage than maybe we would even. And the author of Hebrews is writing to them, and he's trying to encourage them specifically to avoid that pitfall of making a U-turn. He's saying, yes, some of you have had your property seized. Some of you have been abused. Later in the book, he's going to say, you haven't had to make it to the point of death yet. And of course, the ominous word there is yet. But he's trying to spur them on, and he's trying to say, don't quit the journey, have faith, and that rolls right into chapter 11, and he's trying to give us these examples of faith to encourage us. It's possible to make it. It's possible to make it through this journey even when stuff gets hard. And he goes all the way through Hebrews 11, these different characters, and then of course Hebrews 12 ends with Jesus. Right, Jesus, the author, the finisher of our faith, who's the supreme example of looking ahead and going to the cross for us. So in this series, then, we're going to pick up and we're going to look for a few minutes at Isaac and Jacob, but I actually want to start with a paragraph a few verses before. I'm actually going to start here in Hebrews 11, and I'm going to read a paragraph that starts in verse 13. Okay? Hebrews 11:13 says, all these people died still believing what God had promised them, or still having faith. They did not receive what was promised, or at least fully, right? But they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. And some of your translations may actually use the word pilgrim there, right? A sojourner or pilgrim. Foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back, but they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God was not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. We're going to jump down and specifically apply that to Isaac and Jacob here in a minute. And I think that paragraph I just read could apply to all the characters in Hebrews 11, but it just seems to fit really, really well with Isaac and Jacob specifically. Okay, so again, you've got Abraham gets the promise of God, right, that he's going to have this great nation come from him, and then Isaac is the chosen son through whom this is going to come. A couple weeks ago, we heard the story of how Abraham had faith, even to sacrifice Isaac. He believed God could raise him from the dead. God, of course, spares Isaac, and now Isaac is this first generation of promise that's going to have to wander around while not yet possessing all the promises of God. Isaac's son, of course, Jacob, is going to be the chosen one again. And again, Jacob's going to have a rough life too of wandering around. But again, by faith, they're going to have to believe, as the author of Hebrews here says, they're going to have to believe by faith that God is going to keep his promise, that God is doing what he says he would do. Or if I can put it this way, the author of Hebrews would call them successful pilgrims because they had faith. So again, while this paragraph would probably apply to all of them, I think it specifically applies to Isaac and Jacob. So in these verses, we see the people, they believed God, right? They believed the promises of God. They had faith, and they allowed that belief to guide the way that they lived. They obviously made choices to keep wandering. They made choices to pursue families and try to be that blessing. But then I think we have two amazing statements here at the end of verse 16. So I want to read that verse again. So these people had faith through the ups and downs of life, through the good times, through the bad. They allowed it to affect the way that they live. But verse 16 is a verse, I thought a lot about this week. It's really profound. It says here in verse 16, they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. Okay, so we got that. By faith, they're looking ahead to that. But then notice here the two things here at the end that we kind of tend to gloss over, but these are two pretty amazing things that God says here. It says, first off, that is why God is not ashamed to be called their God. I'd like to just pause and kind of let that sink in for a minute. Because I think often we talk about not being ashamed of our faith and not being ashamed of God, and that's good and true, and that's another talk for another day. But notice here what the author of Hebrews says. God's response to these people that had faith is that God was not ashamed to be called their God. Now, again, if we had time today, and I'm not going to take the time to do it, but if you did a Bible search or Google search, you'll find that God is often called the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Like their names are in there, and God is saying that he approved of that. He had no problem being called their God. Or if I can say it positively, God was proud to be called their God. Now, as I thought about this, I thought about being a proud parent. Now, again, we're not going to tell too many stories because I've been threatened possibly by children that live in my home not to tell stories anymore, so I'm not going to tell a lot of stories, and the people are entirely anonymous and fictional, kind of like that little disclaimer at the end of movies, right? Any relation to actual people is entirely coincidental, right? But I'm sure those of you guys, ladies, especially those of you that are parents, you've probably had moments of being the proud mom and dad, right? Your kid gets the award, they get the certificate, they win the spelling bee, I don't know, whatever it is, right? But then you've probably had moments where you may not have been the proud mom and dad. Right, you get that email from the teacher that's sent to everybody in the classroom with some problem, and you're just like, please don't let that be my kid. Remember a couple years ago, I got an email that went to all the parents, and it was apparently some kid in the back of the room had figured out how to use a magnifying glass to melt crayons, and the teacher's like, don't do that, tell your kid, and I'm just thinking, please don't let that be my kid, because in that moment, I would not be proud to be called their dad, right? Now, again, that's kind of a funny thing. I hope that we would all be willing to say, man, I want to have faith in this journey of life because when God looks at me, I want him to not be ashamed to be identified with me. And that's a pretty awesome thought. Now, parenthesis really quick, I don't want to put a crushing weight on us. I don't want us to sit back and say, oh no, if I've ever done anything stupid or bad, God's going to be ashamed of me and all of a sudden this isn't going to work. That's not what I want to do either. Because again, it would not take long to look at Isaac and Jacob and see all the moronic, stupid, sinful stuff they did, all right? So we're not saying perfection here. We're saying that God recognizes faith in Jesus Christ and says, I'm not ashamed to be their God. So we want that kind of faith, right? All right, if we were to read on, then the second amazing thing I think God does here for these kind of people, before we get to Isaac and Jacob, is it says here at the end of 16, not is only God not ashamed to be called their God, it says he has prepared a city for them. Meaning God's going to keep his promise. God's going to keep his promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Rahab and every other character in this story. But here's the good news of the gospel for you and me. God's going to keep his promise to us as well. God's going to come back. Jesus is going to come back. He's going to take us to be with him, recreate everything, set everything right, give us eternal life, and all of those wonderful promises of the gospel itself. God's going to come through for us. You know, when I read this, it reminds me a little bit of John 14. You guys remember John 14? Jesus is talking to the disciples, and Jesus tells them, hey, I'm going to go somewhere. And, of course, Thomas is like, we have no idea where you're going, Jesus. And Jesus, of course, gets the fact that they don't understand what he really means about his death and all that. And Jesus says, I'm going, but I'm going to prepare a place for you. And later on, I'm going to take you to be with me, and we're going to be together forever. So, again, that's the feel here that we get. So as we see these pilgrims, these successful pilgrims that have faith, we see it sort of illustrated big picture in this first paragraph. We see that they believe that they have faith, that it impacts the choices they make and the way we live, or the way they live, that God is not ashamed to be called their God. God keeps his promises. And now, for my last couple minutes, I want to zero in on how that works specifically with Isaac and Jacob. So actually now we're going to skip a few verses down if you're following along. We're going to skip over the Abraham and Isaac section that was already discussed here in a very good message you can go back and listen to. And I want to jump down to verse 20 and 21. My last two verses today here before I wrap it up momentarily. So I got verses 20 and 21, and it felt a little bit, when Chris told me this, it felt a little bit like when he gave me the Enoch passage. I preached on Enoch a couple weeks ago if you weren't here for that. And I feel like Chris gave me like the really short ones that don't have a ton to work with right here. Okay? Like if you look at Moses, it's like, Moses led the people out and he, endured reproach for the sake of Christ. Like that preaches really well. And I got, Enoch wasn't anymore because God took him. And then I get Isaac and Jacob, and let's read it, okay? Here's what it says. It says, verse 20, it was by faith Isaac promised blessings for the future to his sons Jacob and Esau. Verse 21, it was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. Move on to Joseph, who, again, is a much cooler character in this chapter, all right? So I debated a little bit as to how much to go back to Genesis and look at Isaac and Jacob, and I'm not going to take much time to do that today. So if you're unfamiliar with these guys and these stories, you could go back at the end of the book of Genesis, sort of mid to end of Genesis, and you could look at these stories. So I want to zero in, I think, on the one element of faith that we see discussed here in Hebrews chapter 11, where how did these guys who were literal sojourner pilgrims, how did they evidence faith according to Hebrews 11 right here? Well, it says here, if I can paraphrase for a second, it says that they blessed, in Isaac's case, he blesses his kids. In Jacob's case, he does bless his kids, but that's not mentioned here. He blesses his grandkids. So they had the faith to give a future blessing to the future generations because they believed that God was going to keep his promise. So as literal pilgrims, they had faith, and the author of Hebrews here again is going to jump in, and he's going to say, this is the example of faith. Now again, while giving a blessing to your kids and grandkids is awesome, it just doesn't feel as cool as Noah built an ark and saved the world. Like it just doesn't feel that cool. But I think it's interesting here that to the author of Hebrews, this is noteworthy. Like this is important. This mattered to the author of Hebrews and to God, of course, who inspired Scripture to be written. This mattered that these two guys had enough faith at the end of their lives to look at their kids and grandkids and say, I'm going to speak a blessing from God on you that's essentially repeating parts of the covenant that God gave to Abraham because I have dedicated my life as a pilgrim to believing this, and I'm going to bless you in that way and sort of shove you in the back a little bit into this pilgrim life of faith. And as we would see with these other characters, these blessings are going to have an impact on them. So the first one we see here is we see Isaac. Isaac is going to bless Jacob and Esau. And of course, that's an interesting story in and of itself. There's deception there and favoritism and a whole bunch of stuff that happens there in that story that I don't know that we would really say is a great example of faith. But at the end of the day, Isaac, even though he may have been deceived and showed some favoritism and other stuff, at the end of the day, he speaks this blessing to his kids. And it sticks at least with Jacob. Esau, of course, goes out, and that's another story in and of itself. But Isaac here is going to bless these two kids, again, by faith. He's looking forward. I'm sure that Isaac is thinking back to the times that he talked to his dad, Abraham. And when Abraham tells him the story perhaps of meeting God or God, cutting the covenant with him through the animals and all that kind of stuff that you could read about back in Genesis, and Isaac is passing this on. Or to put it another way, Isaac did not become distracted like we talked about earlier. Isaac's blessing and Jacob's blessing here in a minute, they're going to be propelling these guys on to the Abrahamic covenant, and they're not simply going to give blessings about other stuff in life. They're also not going to be tempted to turn back. They're not going to look at their kids and grandkids and say, you know what, my life was a waste. I'm sick of walking around sandy rocks forever waiting for God to do his thing. You guys should do something else with your life. Go back to Ur and, I don't know, worship the moon god or whatever, right? Like they don't do that, right? They don't say go back. And again, they don't wish away that journey. They're going to recount parts of their journey. So we see that with Isaac here, Isaac's 2 kids. And then again, author of Hebrews here says essentially the same with Jacob. But it's interesting here, he focuses on Jacob's grandkids. Again, for sake of time today, we won't read through all the story in Genesis, but often if you hear this preached on, it's the blessings that Jacob actually gives to some of the other kids, because again, those preach really well. Like when Jacob gives the blessing to Judah and says the scepter won't depart from Judah. Like again, that preaches really well because we get to David, we get to Jesus, and that's great. But often we skip over this story where Joseph's kids are blessed. So you've got Jacob blessing his grandkids, okay? So again, really quickly, if you remember that story, famine has come to the land. Joseph, of course, had already been sold into slavery a long time ago. The brothers find Joseph, and again, you can read all this in Genesis. But then Jacob, who has believed Joseph to be dead for many, many years, is able to finally come, and not only is Joseph alive, but now he's got grandkids, and you can kind of picture the moment, right? You've got the grandfather that thought his kid was dead, and now his kid's not dead, and he's got grandkids, and all this is going to happen, and Joseph is going to bring his 2 kids, Ephraim and Manasseh, he's going to bring him to Jacob. And we're going to have an interesting moment, though, that's going to happen in the story. Sort of like the deception and the plot twist and all of that's going to happen with Isaac's blessing. We get a weird little wrinkle here in Jacob blessing his grandkids. Okay, if you were to go back and read the story, we've got an older son and a younger son out of the 2 grandkids. And it was tradition throughout the ancient Near East that the older kid got a better blessing. So if you're here today and you're the older kid, you would have got the better blessing. So there you go. Text your younger sibling and remind them of that today. I don't know. That can maybe counteract all the jokes they give you about being older, right? But if you're the older kid, traditionally you got the better blessing, and that was signified by the right hand. So if you can picture 2 kids come up, the 2 grandkids come up to elderly Jacob, and the right hand is supposed to go on the older kid, left hand is supposed to go on the younger kid, and he's supposed to utter blessings on both. Well, if you go back and read in Genesis, he does this. He crosses his hands. Now, again, to us, we read that and we're like, okay, big deal. That's kind of weird, but why does that matter? But this was a huge deal, and in fact, Joseph actually gets mad. Like he tries to uncross the hands, and Jacob says, no, this is the blessing, and presumably God is showing him by faith that that's what he's to do. Now, I tried to think of an analogy or an example that would help us understand sort of the shock and awe there, and I guess I revert a lot of times to my teaching examples, but here's the example I thought of, all right? You can imagine going to a high school graduation. Can you imagine that? I've been to a bunch, right? But that's another story. But anyway, hopefully you've been to, your own if you're that old, or maybe you've been to kids or other people. High school graduation. Can you imagine what would happen if you had the entire senior class there in regalia and everything? Maybe they're seated there on the side, wherever they are in this auditorium. If they're there, and for sake of my illustration, the entire junior class we're going to say is forced to be there. Can you imagine what would happen if the superintendent, principal, whomever's going to do this, gets up and says, okay, families, welcome to graduation today. I'd like all the juniors to stand up and graduate. I mean, there'd be a borderline riot, right? I mean, the seniors would probably just start, burning and pillaging, and I don't know what would happen. I mean, it would be this awful scene. And of course, that's sort of ridiculous, but if that kind of strikes you as ridiculous, maybe now you see how Joseph felt. This is ridiculous, right? The older kid's supposed to get it, not the younger kid, but even this is seen as an act of faith. And then the author of Hebrews quotes one more thing that I want to touch on. So Jacob, again, is showing his faith as a sojourner to bless this generation, even when it seemed crossed up to other people. But then the author of Hebrews makes the point here. It says in verse 21, it says, by faith Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. And again, that seems kind of like a random detail. Why would you bow and worship as you lean on your staff? Like what, how is that in there and such? But again, I think this idea of worship is going to be an evidence of faith. In that moment, not only did he show faith in how he blessed the grandkids and crossed the hands, not only did he show faith in that, but he still has faith to worship a God that he cannot see. He still has faith that the God that he cannot see is going to keep his promises to Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, through his kids and all that. He's got faith, and it's going to lead to worship. And I think worship, and this is probably, again, another talk for another day, worship is sort of a natural outflowing of faith. Because if we really believe that God is good, and God is love, and God is omniscient, and God is holy, and God is, fill in the blank with all the other stuff that God is, a response is worship. I mean, that's amazing that God is that good. It's amazing that God knows that much. It's amazing that God is that powerful. So I think we see sort of that byproduct here in Jacob's life as an outworking of his faith. So in this passage, I think we'll see, hopefully we've seen, the idea that these successful pilgrims, whether they're Isaac or Jacob, original audience of Hebrews or you or me, successful pilgrims have faith on the journey. We want to avoid those pitfalls I mentioned. So I want to take a couple minutes here, last 2-3 minutes, I want to come up with a couple applications, and then we'll wrap it up and transition to communion. So as we think about having faith, as we think about doing our journey by faith, I've got applications that are going to link up with the pitfalls that I mentioned, okay? So how do we do this? How do we walk by faith today? Application number 1 of 4, quickly, application number 1, don't be sidetracked by the good parts of the journey. Don't be sidetracked by the good parts of the journey. Now notice here, I didn't say don't enjoy the good parts, but don't be sidetracked by them. The journey matters, but the destination is more important. And I think for a lot of us, and again, I don't know all the needs and situations of everyone in here, and I'm sure that some of us are doing really well today, and some of us probably aren't, okay? But I think the point here is, I think sometimes when we're doing well, some of those subtle distractions from good things can be just as deadly as the next point I'll make about turning back. So, how could we apply this? Don't be distracted by the good parts of the journey. Take some time today, maybe list it out on a piece of paper or type it or just think, but take some time today to ask yourself the question, what good things in my life are most likely to distract me? What good things in my life are most likely, for instance, to take time away from my personal walk with God? And again, these could be writing good things. But what things might be in my life during my journey of faith that are distracting me? What things maybe consume time that I would normally spend in my walk with God? Then, after you've sort of thought through that, maybe listed those out, ask yourself the question, how can I adjust those things? Not necessarily eradicate them, but how can I adjust those things? How can I do this journey by faith, not distracted by the good things? Not tempted to use the Old Testament imagery, not tempted to go out of the land, right, and do something else, but how can I not be distracted by the good things? Application number 2 of 4, quickly, it says, or my notes say, don't be discouraged by the bad parts of the journey. So first off, don't be sidetracked by the good stuff, but number 2, don't be discouraged by the bad parts. So again, as you think about this, maybe list it out or think about it today, talk with your spouse or other people about this, think together, but maybe ask yourself the question, what things most often discourage me? Maybe those are things, situations, maybe physical things, financial things, maybe other people in your life that are discouraging. I'm not sure what it would be for you, but what things most often discourage me? What things most often cause me to doubt? What things most often cause me to doubt? So think about those things. What are the difficult parts in your journey? And again, what we don't want to do is we don't want to be tempted to turn back. We don't want to start saying, if God loved me, this wouldn't be in my life, and so God must not love me, and I want to turn back. No, it's not where we want to go. Okay, there are tough parts to the journey, so let's think about what those are, and then what truths about God or promises of God speak to these issues. And this is where we want to apply the gospel to life. We talk a lot about that here. But how do we apply the gospel to the difficult times in life and seasons in life and doubts and discouragements? Take some time and think about that or list it out. Application number 3, almost done. It says here then, maximize your time while on the journey. Maximize your time while on the journey. So again, let's not ignore it or wish it away, okay? So thinking about that, maximize your time while on the journey. What is one situation or circumstance in my life that I'm currently trying to ignore or simply endure? So what is one circumstance or situation in my life that I'm trying to ignore or simply endure? Again, maybe that's a phase in life, maybe that's a relationship with a coworker, something like that. But what's one situation in the journey in your life that right now you're trying to put the blinders on, you're trying to ignore or simply grit your teeth and endure and really not be there as a person of faith, at least mentally and spiritually? So try to think of at least one situation like that. Then ask yourself the question, how can I leverage that situation for Christ? Now, your first reaction is going to probably be there's no way to do that. And again, think a little harder, but how can I leverage this? Because if God is in control and God has me on this path, walking by faith, nothing on this path is an accident. And there's always a way to leverage things for Christ. So, maximize your time on the journey. Last application, I'm done. Remember to keep a focus on the destination. So, application number 4, remember to keep a focus on the destination. As I said earlier, this is not to the detriment or the exclusion of the journey itself, but let's keep the destination before us. Let's keep our hope before us. Or as we read in that earlier paragraph, Let's see God's promises from afar off and let that propel and push us forward in our walk with Jesus. So one way to perhaps do that today or this week would be to take some time this week to read through the book of Hebrews. If that's too daunting a task, maybe take a section of Hebrews. Take some time to read through Hebrews, read through the book of Hebrews, and make specific note of the promises of God. And there's a bunch in Hebrews. Again, you can do this with any part of Scripture, but since this is sort of intrinsic to Hebrews 11, take some time to look at Hebrews, take specific note of the promises of God, and then note as well how we are to live by faith in light of those promises. So take note of the promises of God, and then more often than not in the book of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews tells us how we're supposed to live in response to that promise. So the book of Hebrews is almost a little bit like a sermon. We've got both the truth and the application. The author of Hebrews is really, really good at that. So take some time, again, look for promises of God, and then try to take note, okay, in light of the fact that, for instance, God will never leave me or forsake me, how does the author of Hebrews say I'm supposed to live then? How should that impact my life? And hope that'll be a blessing to you this week. Okay, let me go ahead and pray for us.